Taoiseach, today the people of Aleppo in Syria are being subject to what any fair definition, or being subject to what any fair description must describe as a war crime. Civilians are not being killed accidentally, Taoiseach, because of a conflict. They are being deliberately and repeatedly targeted. This death and destruction is no accident. It is the primary strategy of the Syrian government and Russian military. Women and children hiding in the basement of buildings with no competence are being repeatedly hit with specialist bunker-bursting missiles. Hospitals are being hit with barrel bombs over a series of days until they are forced to close. Civilians, and in particular children, have no access to simple basic medical care, food or even water. What we are witnessing is a systematic policy of trying to either kill or drive out of the country every person who does not support the murderous Assad regime. This is a potential genocide, and it is escalating by the day. We've already seen millions displaced by Assad's determination to maintain his murderous regime and the support of Russia, which has been critical to saving him. Areas supporting moderate and democratic forces have repeatedly been their focus. The reason there is an international emergency concerning Syrian refugees is directly and unequivocally the actions of these governments. The question for Ireland is, will we stand up for the people of Aleppo and the rest of Syria in the face of these war crimes? Will we say to Russia in particular that the barbarism it is directly facilitating is unacceptable? Unfortunately, the overwhelming bulk of the groups here who describe themselves as anti-war are silent on Aleppo. Because they cannot attack the United States or the West for these actions, they prefer to say nothing. In the case of Sinn Féin, it has engaged in incredible contortions to avoid any direct criticism of Russia and its president. Taoiseach, have you or the Foreign Minister summoned the Russian ambassador or discussed the summoning of the Russian ambassador to convey our views and raise the matter at European Union level with a request for common action? What is the European Union doing right now today in response to this barbarous, murderous activity sponsored by the Syrian government and the Russian government? Is it going to stand by, or will there be action in terms of our relationship with Russia? The Dáil should be unequivocal, as a Parliament, unequivocal in condemning the genocidal attack on Aleppo, and we should arrange for a common agreed statement to do that. More importantly, Taoiseach, have you considered the need to significantly increase support for humanitarian aid in Syria? And I know there has been increases to date, to help those in refugee camps filled with people fleeing the government and Russian bombing. This winter could see an escalating catastrophe unless the international community dramatically increases its aid and support. Thank you. That's John Corlin.
You've got 3 minutes.
The answer to the first question is yes. The Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade called in the Russian ambassador last Tuesday and left the ambassador in no uncertain terms as to the way this country feels about the human catastrophe that is unfolding and has unfolded in both Syria and particularly in Aleppo. The Minister for Foreign Affairs made it perfectly clear our absolute disgust and abhorrence of the bombing of a UN humanitarian convoy going into Aleppo to relieve people who have neither had food nor water for quite some time, and the catastrophic deaths of men, women and children in particular, the bombing of hospitals with the resultant break-off of the discussions between the United States and Russia on this matter. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has also spoken to the High Representative Mogherini last Friday. This matter has been discussed at every European Council that I've been at. The question is, what kind of support do you give? President Putin invaded Crimea and took it over a couple of years ago. There have been destabilisation in a number of Eastern Balkan states. And this position is one of where Russia and Iran have supported Assad. The United States and Europe have supported the opposition. This is a human catastrophe. And perhaps within the European Union, we have always seemed to take peace too much for granted. And a few hours across the shores unfolds the misery and the deliberate destruction of human life across a whole range of fronts. And there are sanctions against Russia, and this country, separately from that, has increased its humanitarian aid on a number of occasions. It's a sad fact, though, that Syria has now been at war for the last 5 years, and that Aleppo is now becoming a symbol of, from a Russian perspective, the success of the support given by the Russian forces to Assad. The intent here is to obliterate Aleppo, clearly. And obviously, from a European Union perspective, ministers spoken directly to High Representative Mogherini. Let me repeat to you, Deputy Martin, that on last Tuesday he called in the Russian ambassador and left the ambassador in no uncertain position as to the way this country feels about the catastrophic humanitarian catastrophe that has afflicted Syria now for some time, but Aleppo in particular.
Thank you, Deputy Martin.
I thank the Taoiseach for his reply, and could I put it to the Taoiseach that it's accepted that we all have enormous sympathy for the civilians in Syria, and we all condemn the war, but unfortunately I think at this stage it's not enough. And I would ask you to clarify, in terms of the discussions with the Russian ambassador, has it been made clear to the Russian ambassador that normal relations as we know them, and I don't say this lightly, but normal diplomatic relations as we know them with Russia must come under the closest scrutiny if this genocide continues, in terms of its diplomatic representation here and in terms of a bilateral relationship, and likewise in terms of the European Union, because from my observation Europe has gone along the line of appeasement. If you take the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and the creeping aggression of Russia over the last while, and likewise its strategy in Syria, has been to render Europe and the United States essentially helpless and bystanders as thousands and thousands of children, women and innocent civilians are being murdered by all sorts of highly destructive weaponry, bombs, call it what you like. And the pictures of young children being dragged from the rubble, I think, represents an appalling indictment of the modern world, that a so-called major power can engage without any sanction on Syria. Sanctions that do nothing in relation to Syria can do that, knowing full well it's essentially in a genocidal way obliterating a population. And I think it's unpalatable, some of the choices that may face Europe in the coming weeks and months in terms of how we deal with this. But deal with it we must, if we're to have any moral compass in terms of how we conduct international relationships into the future. Because Russia has gone too far on this occasion, by any yardstick, in terms of international geopolitics or whatever. It's completely unacceptable, Taoiseach. And I would want to say to you that the Dáil should unite in condemnation of what's going on today in Aleppo. Not last month or 2 months or 6 months, today. And I appreciate the work of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in relation to that.
See, I think what one has to take into account here, Deputy Martin, that you're well aware of, is the intention, the objective and the mentality of President Putin. He did invade Crimea and took it over. There hasn't been a word about it since. There has been destabilisation in eastern Ukraine. There has been pressure on a number of other states there. And in fact, at the European meeting in Bratislava just 2 weeks ago, there was concern expressed about the lack of European Union policy for Eastern Balkan states because of the pressure and the influence that they're coming under from Russia. And clearly, Russia is looking for ports on the Syrian shore, and many indicators are that this is an indication of President Putin's intention to restore, for want of a better word, the reputation of influence that Russia has in the Middle East. Syria was its last hold. but its support, along with Iran, for the Assad regime has resulted in this humanitarian catastrophe. The Minister of Foreign Affairs also spoke to Ban Ki-moon in New York recently at the UN. He has condemned unreservedly the attack and the deaths on the humanitarian convoy. I also spoke to Secretary John Kerry last weekend. Now, as you know, the United States have broken off discussions with Russia in respect of their not measuring up to the agreement that they had. Maybe that's what Russia have wanted, and that Aleppo comes even more into focus to be completely obliterated. And you are right about the kind of bombs and cluster bombs and bunker bombs that are now being used. And this matter is discussed at the European Council. They're not going to have a European army. Some countries want to send in further assistance, air or whatever else. And then there are countries like ourselves that are neutral and will remain neutral, but are clearly concerned about the humanitarian issues that are there for women, children, and the people of Syria. It's a very complicated geopolitical process. But let me assure you, and let me assure the House, that Minister Flanagan made it perfectly clear last Corla to the Russian ambassador just how strongly this country feels about what's happened and happening in Aleppo before our eyes.